Our text from Jeremiah tonight takes us to about 600 years before Christ. The Assyrian Empire is collapsing. Egypt is vying for influence over Judah and Israel. And King Nebuchadnezzar II of the Persian Empire was threatening Judah. Judah had began practicing idolatry and worshiping other Canaanite gods as well as Baal besides Yahweh. And in the midst of all the political turmoil that was taking place, many prophets were busy saying, "It's okay, peace, peace, everything's going to work out." But Jeremiah had to bring a different word. For those living in Jeremiah's world in Judah, the northern kingdom, God had revealed to Jeremiah and told him to proclaim that everything was not going to be okay. The temple, the place where the Israelites believed God lived, was about to be destroyed. Everything that once held Israel's faith together was falling apart. For generations, Israel had tried to live their relationship with God through the commandments, written on the stone tablets, rules outside of them, laws carved into rock. But Jeremiah says something extraordinary. God says, "The days are surely coming when I will make a new covenant. I will put my law within them, and I will write it on their hearts." Not on stone, on the human heart. Jeremiah is describing a movement in the life of faith from external religion to interior transformation. You can obey laws written on stone without loving the one who wrote them. But when the law is written on the heart, obedience becomes desire. Relationship replaces performance. Almost 1,000 years later, Augustine of Hippo would wrestle with this same mystery. He once prayed these words to God: "Give what you command, and command what you will." Augustine realized something profound. God doesn't just command holiness. God plants the very desire for holiness within us. We enter this world as vessels of God's grace in God's presence. I believe when we're small children, we can grasp and understand the closeness of God within us. But as we begin to choose self over others, as we begin to learn to discriminate and to hate, we begin building interior walls that separate us from true communion with God. We heard Psalm 51 tonight. Psalm 51 is an honest and raw prayer. Tradition says that this psalm was written by King David after he was confronted by the prophet Nathan. David had abused his power. He had betrayed trust. He had caused suffering. And even had a friend and servant killed. When Nathan exposes the truth, David could no longer hide. Yet in that moment, David prays, "Create in me a clean heart, O God." The word create is the same word used in Genesis when God creates the world. David isn't asking God to tidy things up a little. He is asking God to start again. Because sometimes our hearts become cluttered with the things that slowly build walls between us and the presence of God. Resentment, fear, shame, control. As I said a minute ago, I believe as children, many of us knew what communion with God felt like. There was a natural openness, a trust, an awareness of the sacred woven through life. But as we grow, we begin making choices that pull us away from that inner wisdom. Each time we ignore that quiet voice inside of us, each time we choose something that fractures love or truth, it's like laying another brick in a wall. John Wesley said that true religion is not simply outward behavior, but right tempers toward God and neighbor. In other words, our path home, our way back to communion with God is about the transformation of the heart. The tearing down of those inner walls begins when we honestly pray, "Create in me a clean heart, O God." But the walls we build are not just inside of us. They rise between us. The letter to the Ephesians speaks to a church divided by history. Jews and Gentiles worshiping together carried centuries of suspicion and separation. Even the architecture of the temple had reinforced those man-made divisions, stone walls marking who could come close and who had to stay outside. Into that world, the writer declares, Christ has broken down the dividing wall of hostility. Christ doesn't simply encourage people to be nicer to one another. Christ dismantles the walls that separate us and creates what the letter calls one new humanity. This means the work of tearing down the walls is not just personal, it's communal. This may offend some here, but I believe our disaffiliation as a church was demonic. We took a step away from God's kingdom when we separated and fractured as a church. Division is never the work of God. Dietrich Bonhoeffer once wrote, "The church is Christ existing as community." When we live divided from one another, when we nurture grudges, maintain distance, or protect ourselves with silence, we are rebuilding the walls Christ has already broken. But reconciliation requires vulnerability. It requires us to step out from behind the bricks we've stacked up for protection. On the night before Jesus' death, he speaks quietly to his disciples. No crowds, no miracles, just a simple image. I am the vine, you are the branches. Branches don't produce life themselves. They receive life from the vine. Jesus' invitation is simple: abide in me. The Greek word means to remain, to stay, to dwell. Faith is not striving harder. Faith is staying connected to the source of life. The early Christian teacher, Cyril of Alexandria, said that through the Spirit we share in the very life of Christ. John Calvin said something equally striking. As long as Christ remains outside of us, all that he has done remains useless. The point of faith is not admiration from a distance. It's participation in the life of God. I've shared a little more in depth over the last several weeks about my journey of faith, walking the aisle to be baptized at age 8. But at Philmont Scout Ranch at age 13, sitting on a cliff and looking out at God's creation. Seeing the face of God in God's creation and no longer being able to believe that this was just an accident or chance and circumstance, but that it was intentionally made, that there was intelligence behind it. But even with that revelation of God, I would spend the next 30 years of my life chasing God on the periphery, just getting glimpses. It took me to get into my mid-40s before I truly became aware that the presence of God was within me, that the presence of God is within each of us. I believe that discovering the internal presence of God is our spiritual journey. Yet through different stages of life in different time periods, we will find new meanings and encounters with God in different ways. For me, when I found God on the inside, I have to be truthful that I did not at first dismantle the walls from where I had placed God safely. It was like prayer was going into a room, telling God what I was going to do, shutting the door on my way out, and never taking time to listen for God. This is the prayer life of many of us. We still have God neatly packaged away within us. We go to God when we need help, but we can conveniently kick that door closed really fast when we really don't want to hear what God has to tell us. But God has never been distant from us. I had been the one building the walls within myself. Every time I chose distraction instead of attention, fear instead of trust, ego instead of humility, I was laying another brick, another barrier, firming up another wall. Now I believe the spiritual journey is less about searching for God out there and more about dismantling the walls I have constructed within. The writer Thomas Merton described this beautifully when he said, "The false self is the person we pretend to be. The false self builds walls to protect us. But the true self, the self created in God's image, lives in communion." So I have an invitation for you this week. In your quiet time, identify and name one wall within you. Maybe it's fear. Maybe it's resentment. Maybe it's the illusion that you have to carry everything alone. And then begin the work of letting the wall fall, removing the bricks that we have placed there. Because the God we seek is not far away. The divine presence is already nearer than we could imagine. closer than breath. Amen.